Linda Deutsch. If you have read a newspaper in the last 45, 50 years about any major trial in the world, you have likely read her name, Linda Deutsch. Linda, welcome.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to be here with you.
That's an honor. Linda, I want to start, if I might, at the beginning. I want to start by inviting the audience to understand a little bit about your beginning.
Writing was in my family. My uncle, who was probably the most influential figure in my life, became a journalist. He worked for the New York Herald Tribune, and then he came to California because he met the love of his life who lived out here. And so he wanted to be with her in California. He made trips back occasionally, and he was the one that urged me to get into journalism.
Prophecy is dubious business. We don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But had your uncle not been an encouraging force to you?
Would I have been a journalist?
Yes.
Most likely I would have found my way, but not as quickly as I did, because he came to visit while I was in high school. Mm-hmm. And so in my junior year of high school, I was already selling stories to the local paper. And I was writing they had a school page of the Asbury Park Press every week. And I was basically writing the whole page. I got into journalism and I ran with it. I loved it.
Yes, the power of mentorship.
Right, and
Okay.
mentorship wound up being a big thing in my life, because not only my uncle, because he was the driving force, but he went back to California. Mm-hmm. I went to Monmouth, and they did not have a journalism program. I was an English major. I loved the written word. I became editor of the campus literary magazine, which was a prize winner. It was fabulous. And we would go out and we would interview famous authors. Mm. That was the beginning of my interviewing experience.
Do you remember any that you interviewed?
Oh, sure. We went and interviewed John Cheever at his home up in Ossining, New York. We interviewed the poet Leroy Jones in the Bowery in New York. Mm. We had some great interviews, and we won prizes every year for the magazine. So that's where I was focusing, because there was no journalism program. Right. But then there was one semester of journalism offered. Mm-hmm. And of course I took the course. Well, the teacher said to me, "You don't need this course. You've been doing all this already." I was already feature editor of the campus newspaper, and I was selling stories to the local paper. And he said, "Why don't you just work on class time?" So that was terrific. But then he did something for me that was life-altering.
Which is?
He got me a summer job with the paper in the town where I was born, Perth Amboy. The Perth Amboy Evening News.
In a weekly newspaper?
No, it was a major daily.
Okay.
I kind of lived a charmed life from the time I got into journalism. While I was working at that paper, I was reading through the paper one day, and I saw that there was going to be this Civil Rights March on Washington. Mm-hmm. And I was fascinated.
This is now 1963,
Right.
August.
Right.
August 1963. Yep. You become aware of this March on Washington, a civil rights demonstration, highly controversial at the time.
Yes, they were predicting violence. I knew plenty about the civil rights movement because I was editor of the campus literary magazine. We'd written about it. And there were many activists in my class. There were kids that had gone freedom riding, all of that. I was working this night job. I didn't see the editor, but I clipped out a clipping from the paper about the march, right, and left it on his desk at night when I left with a note saying, "Don't you think we should cover this?" Because I was 18 years old. I had no standing to really demand anything. Right. And he called me at home the next morning, and I'll never forget it. He said, "So you want to cover this, huh?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd really like to." And he said, "Well, okay, you can cover it, but it can't cost us anything." That was my first lesson in journalistic economics.
Okay, tell us about journalistic economics.
And so I knew that I couldn't spend any money. So
how are you going to
how am I going to get there?
From Perth Amboy, New Jersey,
to Washington,
D.C.?
I called the NAACP chapter and told them I wanted to write a story and could I come with them on their bus. They were delighted to have me. And that's how I got there. I went with them on their bus.
So the power of initiative, the power of creativity and audacity again rears its head.
But it was dangerous, and I could not tell my mother that I was going
Why?
because she would have worried desperately that I was going to be harmed. They were predicting riots. They were predicting all sorts of stuff. And I was then staying in Perth Amboy with my aunt, and she and I conspired basically not to tell my mother and for me to just go.
But just talk for a minute of just how controversial race relations were in America at that time.
People were getting killed in the South. Cheney and Schwerner and the three guys, the civil rights workers who were murdered,
Yes.
were a huge story. There had been a lot of people murdered. It was
Risky.
risky, but I didn't think of that. When you're 18 years old, you don't think of that. And as it turned out,
Well, you thought about it enough not to tell your mother.
that's true.
Okay. So
But
now,
as it turned out, it was one of the most peaceful demonstrations that ever happened in this country. And for me, as a person, looking at the civil rights movement, it was life-altering. I mean, I remember standing out there with my arms around people in the crowd, black and white, singing "We Shall Overcome." You couldn't help but join in. It was so affecting.
now, when you were there, you heard many speakers you were covering. Was it evident to you that this young, charismatic preacher, not particularly well known at the time, named Martin Luther King, was to be destined to be the leader that he became? Was that
It was too chaotic for one thing. I did hear him give the speech, but the famous "I Have a Dream" speech.
yes?
But it was so late in the day. They held him until the last, and everybody was trying to get out of there and go home. So it was a wonder that we even listened to it, but we did. And I was able to track down my story from that day, which
did.
it was my first front page byline.
In the Perth Amboy
Yeah,
newspaper.
and it did mention the speech, and it said that one of the members of our group thought it was the greatest speech he had ever heard. Now, you have to realize that the Washington Post that day wrote a story about the march and never mentioned Martin Luther King
Wow.
because he was too late. It was too late in the day, and
Right.
they just didn't notice. And actually, when you're in a group like that where there were so many thousands of people, it's hard to sort it out. But it was obvious that it was important. And the lead on my story said that it was possibly the most important civil rights event up until that day. So it was 1968, June, and my shift started at midnight because it was the night of the California primary, Democratic
Right.
primary.
Yes.
And we knew that results would be coming in and so forth. So I got to the office just before midnight. And at midnight, 5 after, Bobby Kennedy was shot. And our entertainment writer, Bob Thomas, was
Who I knew.
the only one there for AP. He had been assigned at the last minute because nobody thought anything would happen, that the results wouldn't come in till the morning, and Kennedy would give a speech and Bob would cover it. Bob should have gotten the Pulitzer for that night because he was standing right next to Kennedy, saw him shot, saw blood on his head, and called into the office and said, "I have seen the senator and there's blood on his head. He's, mortally wounded." It was the first that anyone in the country knew about it
Right.
because TV had stopped broadcasting. And Kennedy was in the kitchen at the Ambassador Hotel. He was not on camera.
Right.
I wrote stories that
Bob,
night.
He called you.
He called the bureau,
And you.
and he dictated the whole thing. And he said that he actually got up on a steam table in the kitchen, because Bob was very short, as you may remember.
I do.
And he stood up there so he could see Kennedy.
Mm.
That was very dangerous.
Yeah.
And
It was bedlam in there.
it was bedlam. And then Sirhan was arrested, and shortly
And
after
Rosie
that,
Greer almost killed Sirhan right on the spot.
that's right, that's right. It was a scene that I have replayed 1,000,000 times in my mind because I covered part of the trial, and because I did huge research on it later when there
So
were
this
theories.
becomes your first major trial.
It's really my first major trial, but I didn't cover it alone.
Okay.
I was very young at that point,
Mhm.
and very inexperienced. I had never covered a trial other than a local trial
So
in New
you
Jersey.
go into a courtroom and you see Sirhan.
I do. But there are two other reporters from New York who are there doing the main stories. I am assigned to do, like, the features, the sidebars, the descriptives. Sirhan noticed me, and he has always noticed me, because in recent years I went to one of his parole hearings,
Mhm.
and when I walked into the room, he looked up and he went,
Mm.
he remembered me.
Wow.
It's been quite a long trek with Sirhan, because there have been theories that he wasn't alone. That's been a persistent
What is
theory.
your thesis now that you've studied this matter for so long?
Well, I did an interview a short time later with Tom Hayden,
Mm-hmm.
who was a very close friend of Bobby's
Mm-hmm.
and was devastated by this whole thing. And I said to him, "Do you think that Sirhan did it alone?"
Yes.
And he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "I'm not sure." I said, "I've done a lot of research on this, and I think there's a possibility he wasn't." And he said, "Do you know why you think that?" And I said, "No." And he said, "You think that because, like a lot of people, you think that significant acts are committed by significant people,
Yes.
and sometimes they are
They
not."
aren't. But his greater point is interesting, that the pattern-seeking creature, the human, has a difficulty reconciling that significant acts can be, okay.
By insignificant people, yeah.
So
I mean,
then,
it's the same thing with Lee Harvey Oswald, and the same thing with Jack Ruby. They were not significant people, but they changed history.
yes. Now, we go to August of 1969.
Okay, this is
You're working at Associated Press,
right.
and then what happens?
I am assigned on a Saturday morning to go to the airport in Orange County to meet President Nixon, who is coming in to see his new Western White House in San Clemente.
Right.
And I am what they call the touchdown person. AP always has somebody at the airport to make sure the president's plane touched down safely. And then you call in, you say, "He's here, touchdown," and you can leave. So I was there till he touched down. I called in, and everybody was in hysterics at the office. And they said, "Forget about Nixon, just get in here as fast as you can. There's been a terrible murder up in Benedict Canyon. And there's a movie star involved." They told me it was Sharon Tate. And they said there are a lot of other
Was
bodies.
she modestly well known at the time?
Modestly, not well. I knew who she was because I was covering the beat.
Yes.
And I knew about Roman Polanski. She was his wife.
And these become known as the Manson murders.
Well, later, much later. Right now it was the Sharon Tate murders.
Sharon Tate murders.
And that night, after we had been writing and writing and writing, and I had been getting calls from all over the world, everybody calling about this, at midnight, the CNS ticker, the city news ticker in the room, sprang to life, and I looked at it and I screamed across the room, "My God, it has happened again." And that was the LaBianca murders.
Another set of murders in Los Angeles, in Los
At the
Feliz.
same time, on the same MO, the same thing. People killed, scrawlings of blood on the walls, saying pigs, horrible.
Helter Skelter.
Everybody at that point thought it was a copycat murder. That sent Los Angeles into a state of absolute panic,
Unlike anything you'd ever seen.
unlike anything the city had ever seen. I mean, the city had seen terrible things, but they had never seen anything quite like this.
Right.
People were going out and buying guard dogs. They were getting alarm systems for their houses. They were not going out. Suddenly, the restaurants were empty. They just stayed home.
Got it.
It was a hot summer. A lot of houses didn't have air conditioning, but no one left their windows open because that's how the killers had gotten into Sharon Tate's. So this became the biggest story it may have been the biggest story to hit LA for all time. And I was assigned to it, and from day one, and I was, looking for possible leads. At one point, they said it was a Satanist group that it was, and I interviewed some guy named Morlock the Warlock, who ran a Satanist church, and he was not involved. And all of this went on and on. It took 3 months before Susan Atkins, one of Manson's followers, was arrested on an unrelated crime, a theft at a store. And she was in the local jail, the women's jail, and she decided to blab about this to her cellmate. And that was what broke the case. That's what broke the case.
And then how do you first hear the name Charles Manson?
It was from a story by a journalist by the name of Larry Schiller, who is still around.
Yes.
And Larry had negotiated the first interview with Susan. He heard about the confession. There had been some stories written about it, but nothing in depth.
And
he got her interviewed, and it was the lead story in the LA Times on the front page on a Sunday morning. I think people who were here then will never forget it, because it was this story of horror of this cult group that lived out at a ranch in the valley under the sway of this evil mastermind, Charles Manson. And ultimately, he was arrested up in the high desert at another hideout. Susan was kept in custody, and she named the others who were involved, Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten. And the arrests were made. And I will never forget the first day I saw Charles Manson. He was being brought in for arraignment. By then, his picture had been on the cover of Time magazine, if you remember, or Life magazine, with this wild hair and the wild eyes and everything. And you thought you're going to see this monster, right? But I was in the courthouse hallway, and in they brought this little teeny person, barely much taller than I, and I'm 5'1". Charlie's 5'3".
wow.
And he was so little. And he was wearing this buckskin outfit with fringes. And he just looked absolutely confused. He was looking around at this mass of people. I mean, there were cameras all over the hallway. In fact, there was such a scrim of cameras trying to get a shot of him that they all collided, and they pulled a water fountain out of the wall, and the whole hallway was flooded.
Wow. So the first sight of Charles Manson is a surprising sight in that he's very short. He's 5'3".
Does not look threatening. Doesn't look like,
He
a
looks
madman.
confused.
He looks confused. He's got kind of shaggy hair.
And then you cover
And then I
the
cover the
most
trial
sensational trial
in
maybe
history.
in history.
Yeah.
And
And
what-
I was not supposed to have done it alone. It was like fate conspired to have me do this by myself.
Destiny also is often written that way.
Oh,
so-
definitely. It was cinematic in a way. The
Shakespearean.
Shakespearean. The Manson family members who testified, and there were like about 100 of them were called to the stand. They were all, portraits out of some kind of
misfits.
yeah.
But were you able to see or discover what his charisma was?
There was no charisma. He was a very clever con.
He's a con artist. He's a
He
grifter.
had spent his whole life behind bars.
Yeah.
He once said, he testified in the trial with the jury not there. He wouldn't repeat it for the jury. He got up and told his story of his life. And he said, I learned in prison, because I was so small, to tell people what they wanted to hear about themselves.
Yes.
The O.J. trial was something that no one could have imagined ever. He was a national hero. He was a football hero. He was a Hall of Fame football player, Heisman Trophy winner. He was a movie star. He was a
Handsome, movie star handsome.
He was gorgeous. He was huge, big guy, because he was a football player. Had these chiseled features. He was just beautiful. And charismatic. His charm just never ended. Mm-hmm. Everybody loved O.J. He transcended race. Actually, as I've said many times, he was the most famous American ever charged with murder. Mm-hmm. That in itself would have been enough to put this trial over the top.
Then the trial ends in the most unexpected way.
Right.
O.J. Simpson, who many, many, many people felt.
Many white people felt.
Many white people. Virtually all white people felt.
This one didn't.
Well, maybe.
Well.
But you do have a different point of view, and a very informed point of view, because presumably you watch this more closely than
I was there every day, sitting there right behind him.
So you have a different point of view. Yeah. Tell me what most animates you. What is the single biggest piece of evidence? Because I know many people who respect you, are very fond of you, and think you're out of your mind. You know this. They think, how could you not?
I will tell you what O.J. has said about me.
Okay.
He gave an interview about me to a magazine. And he said, you know, she's never said she thought I didn't do it, but she's never said she thought I did it anyway, either. And that's why I talked to her. And so after the trial, he talked to me.
Did O.J. Simpson call you? When did O.J. Simpson
first call me? He called me right
you?
after the acquittal. Well, actually, no, it was after the civil trial.
He called you?
Yeah. And he had talked, no, it was after the criminal trial he called me. And he had talked to no one at that point. He'd been in prison for a year.
Right.
And he was with a friend who said, if you want to talk to someone that's been fair to you, call Linda Deutsch. And he called me, and I interviewed him, and it was a huge sensation because he had talked to no one.
Right.
And I had also become the voice of the trial because I'd been on television so
yeah,
much.
I would watch you every day.
Yeah.
But it is your opinion. First of all, let's establish that you believe that the prosecution did not conclusively prove that case.
That's true.
That's true.
Mm-hmm.
Now I ask you a different question.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, do you believe that O.J. Simpson murdered Nicole Simpson?
That's the question I will never answer because I don't know. It's not my job. It was never my job to determine that. I have asked him about it innumerable times.
How does he speak with you about it? Or how did he speak with you?
He was very open about everything. I don't think he ever held back on me. He was very...
Was it convincing?
Very convincing. I went down to Florida to interview him on the 10th anniversary of the killings. Mm-hmm. And I told him that I had been contacted by someone who was like a deep throat type, who gave me an alternative idea of how this might have happened and how he could have been there but wasn't really the killer, but he was involved and all this. And I said, what do you have to say about this? And he looked me straight in the eye and he said, I don't know because I wasn't there.
How much credit do you give, in hindsight, to Johnny Cochran for that verdict?
For the verdict?
For how important do you think Johnny Cochran?
He was very important. He was a fabulous lawyer. I mean, if I had ever been charged with a crime while he was alive, I would have called Johnny. He was brilliant. He was charismatic. He was a showman in the courtroom. When he was arguing, lawyers would come from around the courthouse just to listen to him. He was that good.
Do you have any connection or do you have any communication with O.J. Simpson?
I'm in touch with his lawyers. I'm sure when
Is he a broken man?
I don't think so. I don't think he'll ever be broken. But he'll be different when he comes out. Where O.J. Simpson was famous in this country Michael Jackson had the world
Yes.
looking at him.
Agreed.
And the whole thing was a debacle. It should never have been tried. He was
An overzealous prosecutor.
absolutely, who saw himself as some sort of Javert chasing Jean Valjean, because he
How poetic.
well, he had tried to get Michael before and had failed.
Mm-hmm.
And after Michael was acquitted in this case, I went to the press conference and I asked him, the prosecutor,
Mm-hmm.
I said, "Are you through chasing Michael Jackson?" And he said, "No comment."
Wow.
And that night, Michael left his beloved Neverland and never came back.
Wow.
But preceding that, there was this crazy trial with 2,000 media accredited.
Hmm.
They were not all there at the same time, or little Santa Maria probably would have sunk under the weight.
Right under the weight.
But most of them were tabloid journalists. This was the advent of the tabloid trial.
Mm-hmm.
And
what toll do you believe, in hindsight,
Mhm.
what toll do you believe that trial took on Michael?
I think it killed him. I think the trial killed him. You could see him shrinking during the trial physically. When it was over, he called me. I mean, they all call me. It's amazing. But I had met him, and I saw him every day. And he finally called me after it was all over to thank me for being fair to him, because
Mhm.
nobody else was.
Mm-hmm.
They all were out to get him in one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to him, "Michael, how was the trial for you?" And he said, "It was the hardest thing I ever did in my life."
Mm-hmm.
And that was true. Michael was a very sensitive and gentle soul, and he was not up to this. He became ill over and over again. I talked to his lawyer frequently, Tom Mesereau.
Who you have great respect for.
I do, and I think that he did an amazing job on the trial. And he took over a case that seemed unwinnable.
Mhm.
I mean, Michael was not helping him at the very beginning.
No, he sure
because
wasn't.
he had a different lawyer. He had Mark Garrigus,
Mhm.
and Garrigus somehow got him aligned with the Black Muslim group,
Mhm.
and that was not good. And then one day, just before his arraignment, he's outside the courthouse, and he jumps up on top of a van and starts dancing on top of it on an SUV.
Not a crowd
Not
pleaser.
good.
Right.
And so he came in with a lot of strikes against him, not because of what he did,
Yeah.
but because of his whole persona.
Yes.
And I think that Mesereau believed, and I believed, that he was set up, that this woman that brought her child and claimed that he had molested him.
For money.
Oh yeah, the setup was for more than money. She wanted to live at Neverland for the rest of her life.
Mm-hmm.
Michael had been so kind to this woman and her son, who had overcome cancer, that he gave them a suite on the grounds, a little cottage that was normally occupied by Elizabeth Taylor, his friend.
Mm-hmm.
There were swans floating in the thing outside. There were flowers everywhere. There was music playing. It was idyllic. This is a woman who had been living in the ghetto in Los Angeles. She thought she was going to stay there forever. And so when it became evident that she wasn't, and that Michael was going to give them eviction papers, she went to the DA and claimed that he had molested her child.
So you were not surprised that Michael was acquitted?
Oh, I was. As I said, Michael should never have been tried.
Mm-hmm.
But because he was Michael,
Mm-hmm.
there was no way they were going to let it go.
Right.
Robert Blake, he, obviously did not kill his wife, but because he was Robert Blake and because there was a lot riding on it, he wasn't even arrested till a year after the killing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the police chief said he was sure that Blake had been the shooter. Well, that was impossible to prove. He should have known it by then.
Right.
And the thing is, with the people who are acquitted, Blake, O.J., Michael, they are never acquitted in the public mind.
Right. So there was a court of public opinion
and a
there's
court, and yeah.
legal.
And so that is the
And they're not the
tragedy.
same.
That's the tragedy, because supposedly if you go through a trial and you are proven not guilty, you are supposed to go on with your life. Yet none of these three ever did, because they couldn't. The public had, made a different decision. They had tried to second guess the jury, and it was impossible for them to ever live down being tried. And that to me is heartbreaking.
Do you believe that what you have seen has largely made you have faith in the American legal system, concern, or a little of both?
I absolutely have faith in the system. I think that it's the best system that's ever been invented. If you look at what's going on in other countries,
Right.
there is nothing to duplicate the jury system, maybe except in London, in England, and that's a very different interpretation of it, which does not include the press. But I think that, like any system, it has flaws, and there are things that could be fixed. I don't think that O.J. Simpson should have gone to prison in Nevada for a minor crime in a case which was clearly payback for the fact that he wasn't convicted in Los Angeles. You have to realize that the trials I covered, and I've tried to count, but I've lost count. There are at least 60, maybe more. They are show trials. They're not symbolic of anything else.
That's right.
Because these trials give the public a chance to see their system at work and to see something that's emblematic of what's going on in society.
Right.
But they are not emblematic of what's going on every day in courthouses around the country.
Where no cameras and no...
Well, not only that, but most cases are settled.
Let me ask you this in closing. We've talked about your feelings around the American legal system. What about your feelings about journalism in contemporary American life?
Well, in the journalistic world, I sometimes feel like a visitor from another planet.
How so?
Things are not now like they were when I started. They're just not.
Are they better? Are they worse? Or are they different?
I wouldn't say they're better. I think that there is a cult of personality now around journalism that's not healthy. When I started, no one knew who I was. All they knew was my byline. Eventually, I became known because I was the face of the O.J. trial. But there was never this feeling of, I have to cover this because it's going to make my career. I never even thought of that.
Yeah, you just...
But in the electronic media, which is now so prevalent, the TV media,
Right.
stars are made from trials.
Sure.
And that gives you a very...
That Nancy Grace type of personality.
That gives you a very different motivation to be there. I was there to tell the truth.
Linda, thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for being a witness to history over the last 40 years, and thank you for sharing some insights into the very unique world that some would argue you seem destined from a very early age to be called to.